Good morning. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. My name is Drew Clark. I'm the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and today is Wednesday, April 22nd, 12 noon Eastern Time, and of course, other times, wherever you are. We are all pretty much in our home locations, as we have been for many weeks now, and we're really pleased to have a great panel to discuss our topic today about what the tech industry is doing in response to the coronavirus. I thought I would just, again, as I like to do, is step back and give a little perspective on what we're seeing. I just checked the stats on my Johns Hopkins web tracker, 2.5 million global cases of coronavirus, 826,000 in the U.S., about a third of them now here in this country, 179,000 deaths, 45,000 of them in this country, about a quarter of those. And so I don't think there's anyone, at least in my worlds. I mean, we've all been touched by people, coworkers who have had it, struggled with it, maybe recovered, others, of course, not. But clearly, this is a huge crisis. And what we at Broadband Breakfast have been doing is trying to talk about the role that broadband plays in responding to this. And we've had lots of discussions about telework, telehealth, education. That was our first one over a month ago. The role of social and civic connectedness and the role that broadband plays in keeping us together. But we don't view broadband just from the narrow lens of, the wires and the towers that bring it. We also consider broadband to be just as much the role it plays in our lives. Our motto is better broadband, better lives. And so we're really about, not just the ways it gets to you, but how it's used and the applications. And so that's no better way to talk about what we're going to speak about in terms of the technology industry. And obviously the technology industry, we kind of all think about the big platform companies, Facebook, Google, et cetera. But there's so much more, obviously, to it than the biggest of the players. But we are really pleased to have a great group of thinkers and industry advocates to talk to this subject. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to our panel now. We have Rob Atkinson, who is the CEO of the Internet. Excuse me, I'm going to screw up your name. ITIF, which of course is a long-standing group around technology and innovation. And we're going to hear from Rob first, but he'll be followed by John Broya. He is the interim CEO and president of the Internet Association. We're really grateful that he can join us. Internet Association obviously speaks for many of the largest tech companies. And then we also have Daniel Hanley, who's a reporter and policy analyst with Open Markets Institute, and he'll follow John. And then we've got Scott Wallsten, who's the president of the Technology Policy Institute, which kind of covers a lot of the same landscape that I just laid out, both telecom, broadband, and some other aspects of technology. So Rob, let's go ahead and turn to you. You are kind of a thinker on many aspects of tech and broadband, and I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts about what this moment means in particular for the technology industry.
Sure. Well, thanks, Drew. It's a pleasure to join you today. Look, I think for really until around maybe 2015 or so, there was this view that the digital industry, the tech industry, ISP, software, internet were, a force for progress and good. This is amazing. Boy, look at all the things I can do. I can shop online. I can get all this information. And then you had this rise of the techlash. There were a lot of different reasons for it. It became sort of the popular thing now, rather than to say, oh, this stuff is good, it's became popular to say it's bad. You can get your TED Talk. If you say it's bad, you can get it in the New York Times if you say it was bad. So that was kind of the narrative. And now all of a sudden, with the crisis from the global pandemic and the economic collapse and basically the creation of an isolation economy, people have become much more aware of just how useful and how valuable these technologies and applications are for us. So just look at what we're doing right now. We couldn't do this 10 years ago. And we can do this right now because ISPs have built out networks that are incredibly robust. We can do video streaming that works, and we do it, at all times of the day now. So, that's working. Google and Apple are building an app that can potentially tell us if we've been in contact with somebody that had coronavirus. I know in our shop, we use Microsoft Teams now to collaborate. And how many people are shopping on Amazon now as really their only link, even if it's just for groceries. So I think what this really does is it really sets back, if you will, the whole techlash narrative. I think it's going to be there'll still be people out there who have an interest in pushing that narrative, but it's going to be a lot harder going forward to have that narrative get any real traction after what we've been through, and just how clear it is that not just technology, but big companies, Apple and Google are obviously big companies, and they've quickly put together this app. Amazon is a big company, and they've been able to keep their logistics systems going. The internet providers, ISPs, are big companies. So I think it's a combination of, there going to be a greater appreciation of technology and a greater appreciation of the big companies that are able to do this so well for us.
Well, that is a very interesting perspective, and I think either you or one of your senior fellows has written a book. Is it Big is Good? What was the title of that book that you?
That was myself and my colleague Michael Lind at University of Texas, Austin. We wrote a book called Big is Beautiful: Debunking the Myth of Small Business. And just to be clear, we say small business is okay too. The core single message of that book is we should be size agnostic, which, by the way, I will put in a plug for that right now. I find it really, really striking and disturbing that in the US, if you have 501 workers, you're out of luck for getting any help from the government, because you don't really care about those workers losing their job. But if you have 499 workers, well, that's a whole different kettle of fish. You look at what the UK has done under Boris Johnson's administration. They have a program, Gary, it's a loan program, and I don't think it's forgivable the way and that's fine, but at least they have policies to help all size companies. That's really what Europe is doing. So anyway, an aside on that, I think it's a mistake we're making.
Bringing in our fiscal policy discussion, I'm sure we will get to this question of big versus small versus competition. But John, what's your take on the frame that Rob has put on this? I mean, do you think that we're kind of reevaluating maybe the second thoughts that a lot of people seem to be expressing in our culture about the big technology companies and the things that they've done and driven in our economy? Or what else would you like to say about the tech industry's response to the coronavirus?
Sure. And look, first of all, I appreciate you having me on, Drew, and especially with this esteemed panel of guests. Internet Association, we certainly do represent some of the largest companies in the tech space, but the overwhelming majority of our membership includes medium-sized and smaller companies as well. I agree with the central point of what Rob was saying, that prior to 2015, there was a lot more sort of warm and fuzzy feelings generally about the potential benefits and the actual benefits that internet and internet services were offering to people, to businesses. And certainly we have seen an addition of it over the past several years. And I am certainly seeing encouraging signs of people thinking more positively, speaking more positively about the contributions that these companies are making, now that we're all dealing with sort of social distancing and other things that have been put into place in order to keep everyone safe, but hopefully where possible productive during this pandemic. We've got a website, a mini site on our website that our team put together and we launched, I think 2 weeks ago now, that talks in great detail about the many contributions that literally all of our 40+ member companies have been making. And it's updated on a regular basis. I think there's been a lot of focus in the press on some of the things related to content moderation and the work that some of the larger companies that you mentioned at the outset are doing to kind of help surface helpful information about precautions that people can take, information from local, state, and the federal government about what's going on with this crisis, and again, ways that people can keep themselves and their families in a place where they can remain healthy and active, and hopefully also provide a lot of information about how people and businesses can continue to operate and maintain some semblance of connection. And I think at the heart of it, one of the great things that the online services provide is a way for people to connect. That's what they were built to do at the beginning. That's what they continue to do. And it's really heartening to see people kind of come back to the realization that this is a really valuable role that these companies and these services provide. They allow, I mean, I've got elementary school kids in my own house. They're allowing my kids' elementary school teachers to provide lessons to them. But in addition to that, you've got companies that maybe you don't think of off the top of your head as being helpful in this process, but are very much contributing. Like Lyft is working with drivers to provide non-emergency medical transportation to people who need access to medical treatment and services that aren't related to a potential COVID-19 infection, but are nevertheless important to maintain people's health. Airbnb is working to help provide frontline medical professionals with access to safe, free, sanitary housing in close proximity to the hospitals where they're providing care. DoorDash and Postmates and others are working to provide relief funds for small businesses, homeowners, artists, and others, and in many cases also providing easier access to food and sort of essentials that people don't have access to or would have to put themselves at risk if they have sort of a pre-existing medical history that would put them at risk of going out into some of these public places. Amazon is helping out in the same way by providing delivery of groceries and things like that. So there's a huge variety of services that are being offered. And in addition to just the offering of services, there are financial contributions of medical equipment, PPE that these companies are making. And it really demonstrates not only the value of the services, but the commitment that these companies have to serving people and their own communities as well.
Mm-hmm. So as to this kind of broader theme about, I mean, again, I'm not trying to get you to see a silver lining in something that's obviously so dreadful and lethal and fatal. But I mean, do you think things will change when this lets up, whenever it is, right? Will we go back to the same kind of moment we were in, where there was a lot of people saying, "Hey, we really should not be questioning the value that the tech industry has been providing to us, the way we've kind of been doing over the last 2 or 3 years." I mean, do you think we'll go back to that kind of pre-2015, 2016 world, or is it going to kind of pick up exactly where we left off, and there's going to be lots of pressure on some of the biggest companies that we've seen? What is your reaction to that, John?
I tend to be cautiously optimistic when I'm optimistic, and I'm typically optimistic, but there's always that caution part of it. So I 100% agree with Rob's analysis that there are always going to be people in the world that we live in who are going to be critical of the approach that corporations take and the way that they do their business. And I don't think that the current events are going to necessarily change the minds of every single person out there. I think that's just human nature. But at the same time, I think that there is reason for optimism that perhaps we can have a more sober conversation that's more fact-based, that's more based in sort of the reality of, the way that these companies are operating now is just a further iteration of what they've been doing all along the continuum that has led up to this point. This isn't all of a sudden COVID-19 appeared and corporate America saw the light and decided to completely shift the way that they operate. I've worked inside technology companies. Some of my very close friends are still working in some of the largest and many of the smaller companies. This did not change the way that companies approach these issues. They care about privacy. They care about people. They care about communities. And my hope is that this is just an opportunity for these things to now float to the top again, so that as we're having conversations about some of the issues that have been very active on the Hill and elsewhere, there's a little bit more of a balance to those conversations.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. And we'll come back to you, John. Don't worry. There's a lot more to talk about with regard to privacy, with regard to contact tracing, with regard to misinformation and combating misinformation, which kind of can be sometimes a two-edged sword. But let's get another perspective in here. Daniel Hanley of Open Markets Institute, tell us a little bit for our listeners who may not know much about OMI. What is your organization all about? Anything you'd like to say about its kind of history and origin, and what your take is on some of the issues we're talking about here today?
So obviously I work for Open Markets Institute, and my organization specifically focuses on the problems and threat that monopoly has really against democracy. And it's really much broader than sort of the competition, privacy issues. Yes, those are all really important, but we are really talking about the threat that these companies have against democracy. And it's because of their immense control over our really every line of commerce. I mean, they affect and control all the information resources that we're taking advantage of today. And what was your second question? There was a couple of there.
Who is OMI, and what you're doing or what's your reaction to this topic we're discussing, which is, is the pandemic causing us to have second thoughts about, well, actually these companies are very valuable and very important to our economy and society.
Right. So I'll respond to the whole tech lash, that whole issue. So I am one of the people who will say that the tech lash will continue. I think we are recognizing that these companies are immensely powerful, that they were primed, to state a pun, to take advantage of this situation. Right. Like we heard a litany of things that they are doing, donating money, prioritizing PPE, all these other things, but that's because they are able to, right? They have achieved a position unlike any other companies. These companies are unparalleled. They really are they're in the major leagues and everyone else is in the minor leagues, right? They're not even on the bench. But one of the things that I think is really important is to think that don't think these are inevitable, right? They're doing this because they are under immense amount of pressure. Amazon alone is under several investigations from the FTC, the House Committee, same thing with Google from the states and Facebook. They, in my opinion, a lot of these good deeds are coming through, one, because they are able to, but two, it's because they know they need to establish goodwill and change, do whatever they can, really take advantage of the entire playbook to change the public's perception and take advantage of this moment to really relieve some of the pressure that's coming at them right now. And rightfully so. I mean, we've endured their ruthless acquisitions, the treatment of their labor workers. There are countless stories of workers really dealing with abysmal conditions, dealing with really ruthless control, whether it's signing non-competes or the great story that was released by Business Insider about the heat maps that Amazon uses to make sure that the workers at in their Whole Foods division aren't unionizing, or give them sort of a heads up using a variety of factors that Business Insider used, internal documents.
Daniel, let me be clear. What exactly is the criticism? Is it the tech industry generally? Is it the size of a company? Is it the particular practices? And what in your minds kind of subjects such a company or actor to the criticism that your organization brings?
So size is definitely a big factor, right? Because that gives you immense control, especially in technology markets in particular, right? Because they have things like network effects, they have things where users are highly dependent on meeting with other users, right? But it's also about, and the other thing about size is it really gives you power to, especially over the communications mediums, right? They give you immense control to control public perception. I think it was Harvard professor Jonathan Zittrain that said that these companies can control an election without anybody knowing about it. And really just the thought of that, right? If you really even contemplate, even if they don't do these sorts of behaviors, right? There's a lot of these threats that we know can exist, and for a variety of reasons they may not. But the fact that they are able to, really, if one really thinks about that and boils it down, that is utterly alarming that one company could have that kind of control, even if they don't exercise it. I mean, we could call it it's in the antitrust world, the incipiency. We worry about these sorts of things because we know that they can happen.
So you're kind of addressing the size, but also the potential that
Yes.
you see, and you're kind of painting a picture that the tools and the kind of maybe control point that say a Facebook or a Google might have because of the information ecosystem. That's kind of what you're saying is the threat, right? Am I hearing you right, Daniel?
Yes, that's correct. And there are countless stories of these companies using their infrastructure to maintain their dominance. And probably one of the best ones is when internal documents, I think it was BuzzFeed News that released the internal documents of Facebook that showed why they acquired WhatsApp, and that they used their VPN service Anavo to recognize that WhatsApp was sending way more messages than them, and they immediately attempted to acquire, neutralize their threat. I mean, we know that these companies do these things and why they do it, and yet furthermore, we have great public institutions. I'll take the FTC. I'll use the FTC as one example that can bring action and that don't, or that have a broad rulemaking authority to prohibit some of these practices.
Well, we'll certainly get to some of those policy responses and let some others react to what you have to say. But let's kind of round out our group here with Scott and some of your thoughts on the particular issues of competition and the tech industry, and how you view the landscape that Rob, John, and Daniel have all presented different perspectives on. So Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate your events and your work. So I'm pleased that you invited me here. So I think it's important to first note that it's not clear that Techlash was ever as bad as, or ever as intense as it seemed to us who kind of are in this little bubble. If you look at polls of these companies, they certainly had lost a lot of popularity over the last couple of years, but they still remained among the most popular companies in the US. So, first of all, it's not clear how much Techlash existed in the world outside of our policy sphere. But even setting that aside, I think to use a word that's been seriously overused, this pandemic has really disrupted the Techlash script. Like Rob said, we're seeing the benefits of the size of these companies. People don't think of it this way, but we're seeing now the benefits of scale. And I think more broadly speaking, what we're seeing is that people understand that there are trade-offs. And even people who are very concerned about privacy understand that there are trade-offs to having more privacy and less privacy, and things you can do and things that you can't. And all of our policies are about getting those trade-offs correct. And I think people will be willing to have a more serious debate about what that means, and recognizing that there are major benefits that come with how companies operate. But if you look at competition too, I think this will also change the way we've been talking about antitrust lately. And again, recognizing that not everything about big companies is bad. And even if you look within the pandemic, it's not as if these companies have dominated everything. The leading video platform provider, video conferencing provider, was Zoom, which was not related to any of the major companies, except that they relied on AWS, which just shows again the importance of this massive cloud facility. We have TikTok now, which by some measures has more take than Facebook or Instagram. So the idea that these companies face no competition is just not true. I think if you go to the misinformation issue, I think that the platforms are going to have some problems with that later on. I think that's going to be the one thing that might be difficult to deal with. And that's because it starts off as an impossible problem. They always have to figure out whether they want to err on the side of taking things down that should stay up, or leaving things up that should come down. And because people's preferences are so different, they'll never get that balance right. And in the context of the pandemic, they've decided to be aggressive about taking things down that seem like misinformation. And I think everybody agrees, well, most people agree that that's the right approach right now. Misinformation is really dangerous. But then afterwards, people may begin to think that if they were so easily able to deal with misinformation with the coronavirus, why can't they deal with misinformation in other spheres? And they're going to have to figure out how to deal with that problem. I think that's going to be complicated going forward.
Excellent. Thank you for bringing the misinformation angle. Let me just push a little bit more on that. We haven't mentioned the kind of magic word in Washington, D.C., Section 230, right? That's something we've clearly followed a lot at Broadband Breakfast. It's the notion that liability for the actions of a user on a platform do not redound to the platform itself, because the person who puts a defamatory statement can be sued, but they generally don't have the deep pockets, and so it's the kind of thing that protects a Twitter or a Facebook or another platform from that liability. But as you kind of lay out this whole misinformation angle here, you've kind of flipped it the other side. You basically said, well, yeah, I mean, most people agree that taking down potentially false information about the health effects of COVID-19 will be good. But you seem to be saying that that's setting themselves up for some troubles later on. Is that what I'm hearing, Scott? Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I think they're going to face questions of why was it so easy to, or why does it appear to be so easy to take down misinformation in this area, and yet you claim it's so difficult in other areas? And I think part of the answer is that this is one very targeted thing when we have science to rely on, and other areas become sort of fuzzy very quickly and often rely on different people's opinions on things. So it's much harder, but they're still going to be subject to that comment when people potentially not believing that it's a hard problem. And the reason is, I mean, it's a problem that doesn't have a good solution. You can use AI, you can use humans to make these decisions, but someone will always disagree with where you draw the line simply because of differing preferences. And the risk, and it's the right risk to be taking, because I do believe that taking down this misinformation now is really important. But the risk then is that, it may push them to be more aggressive on the side of taking things down. And some people will think that's a good thing, probably, and others may not think that's a good thing. But I think in the future, once this is over, they're going to be pressured to be more aggressive on their platforms. And then they may choose to err on the side of being more aggressive. And whether that's a good thing or not will depend on who you talk to.
Right. Well, wonderful. Well, we've put a lot of meat on the table for our discussion here. Let me actually see if John cares to respond to anything that you've heard thus far from Daniel or Scott or Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with the points that Scott was making. I don't know. I think that there's certainly been a lot of beneficial work that the social media companies in particular have been doing to try and surface, again, helpful, useful information that's been vetted by public health officials about what's going on. I think they certainly have been dedicating a significant amount of resources towards that effort. And I think the amount of resources in terms of both human capital as well as financial investment that they've been making to try and keep things as clean as possible and make sure that important information is getting out there, a reflection of the seriousness of what we're all going through right now, as well as I think what Scott made, the point that Scott made, there are certain things that are more binary than others. So when it's easy to say that something is vetted and clear, it's easy to make a decision about it when you're looking at it as a piece of content and are making a determination as to whether to leave it up on the platform or make it unavailable to people. But the lines get really blurry really fast in a lot of other issue areas. But when public health is on the line, I think the margin of error, you have to err on the side of taking things down. And I sense that is the determination that has been made by several of the companies.
Right. Well, Scott made 2 points that are somewhat in tension, but in a productive way. One of them was that the crisis has illustrated the benefits of size and scale, right, in terms of being able to act and react. But then he also made the point that some of the big players we're seeing, Zoom, TikTok, are not necessarily tied into the big platforms that we think of. And I'd like to ask John and Daniel's reaction, Rob too, but I know you're going to say big is beautiful again. What are your thoughts on this point about size and scale, but also the counterpoint that there's the ability of kind of seemingly new entrants to come in when they are able to figure out the right strategy. So John, first for you on that.
Sure. I mean, that's the beauty of technology, right? There are always, especially when you're talking about something that is built on top of sort of a network infrastructure, and you're essentially creating a web-based app or a web-based app as well as a mobile app. You can innovate very quickly. You can figure out what is missing in the marketplace, and you can provide that. And when you do it in a way that is considerate of people's needs in terms of not just what they desire out of an application, but also their privacy, and you're thinking about other aspects like that, privacy, safety, et cetera, you can bring a really important tool to market really quickly and get a very high adoption rate. And look, all technologies are developed in an iterative way. It's not like you just drop a Model T out there and that's going to be the Ford car for the rest of the lifetime of the company. So I think it presents opportunities not just for the large companies who have already developed and gone a fairly far distance down the continuum of developing, but also for new entrants to come in and provide new solutions that the market really, really needs. And that competition helps the established companies get better, and it gives the public an opportunity to see another way of doing things, another tool that they might want to use and they might prefer to use.
Daniel, what's your reaction to this? The first point, the size and scale maybe seems to demonstrate the ability to do, quote, good things. I mean, do you agree or disagree with that?
So one thing is that these good things are not predicated on the fact that they are big, and small companies can do these things as well. Again, these companies, the largest companies, are positioned to do well in a crisis like this. They have, in some cases, hundreds of billions of dollars in cash just sitting there waiting whether it's acquire to a company or just wait to create to copy rather the next great service. I would like to respond to 2 points though. One is about Zoom and the idea that there's a lot of competition out there, and just to think of how fragile some of these new competitors are. Zoom, obviously the whole privacy issue with sharing information with Facebook was pretty bad for them, right? You had a lot of people abandon their service and jump to, let's say, Microsoft Teams or Google Hangouts. And if you think about just the number of scandals that Facebook and Google and the rest of the tech companies have faced over just the past 10 years or so, and how resilient that they have been. Meanwhile, Zoom makes a decision, albeit a bad one, but they make one decision that people view as a violation of their privacy or their rights that they have. And all of a sudden now they can just be destroyed, just like that, or be significantly weakened. Meanwhile, the rest of big tech, I know Microsoft is quickly trying to copy some of Zoom's quick features. The other one is about misinformation. And one of the things is that I find interesting is, yes, misinformation is a big problem, but its problem is how much it propagates through the dominance of the big companies that are already established, right? If you see it, it's not really it becomes a problem that they're able to propagate on one platform who now has to arbitrate all of that information at once, right? Meanwhile, it's going to hundreds of millions of users. So I will again say that bigness is definitely part of the problem, that we're allowing them to arbitrate speech, create and allow the information, the problem of misinformation to propagate so quickly exists.
I'm struck, Daniel, whether your observations are really just sort of, you're going to have a critique of the leading industry, if you will, and the power they have. Maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it was like the broadcast TV networks, right? And the power that they might have had to shape the landscape. And now perhaps it's because the Twitters and the Facebooks and the Googles are the entities through which information is flowing. I mean, is your critique really about the company, or is it about I guess I should say, is it about the size and scope of the company, or is it about something involved in the technology that's allowing, in your view, these companies to do things that prior generations of big companies weren't able to do?
Well, just respond to the cable aspect. So other areas of telecommunications have been heavily regulated. I mean, the policy of the FCC had many different policies that prohibited companies from being too large. Even now on the books, we have the national audience rule by the not from the FCC, was imposed by a congressional statute that limited the total national audience. I think it's 39%.
Right.
For decades, we had the ownership rules that prohibited the number of licenses across radio and television. So that's a very different policy position versus where the rise of the internet companies, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, really deregulated and have a policy of deregulation that greatly benefited, including Section 230, that greatly benefited the nascent internet industry that gave rise. So you have a very highly regulated industry that was being contained rightfully because of we have recognized for decades the dominance that they have, and a new industry that we didn't quite understand. Mind you, the FCC struggled to understand the power of the internet through their computer inquiries that lasted, I think, a couple of decades. So you sort of have the two spheres there, right? And really, again, it comes down to, we need to take an approach that we've had for decades around specifically about communications and information companies, that they are unique. They pose a unique threat to what they control, the public's perception on any issues, the speech that they arbitrate. We've recognized this for a very long time. Radio and television are perfect examples of how we've acknowledged that in the past.
I'd love to get Rob's perspective. We chime in on this point here about the broader point, the size, the scale, what good things, what potential drawbacks does our economy face from the size and market cap of these big four, big five tech companies?
Sure. So look, you have to, number one, I think the key thing is understand the difference between control and size. Okay, they're not the same. You can have big companies like Walmart that doesn't have control. They're big. You can have small organizations like ICANN that deals with domain names, very, very powerful, an amazing amount of control, but they're a little dinky organization. So they're two separate things. The second issue is not just about do they have control, but do they exercise control? And the answer is they do not. Google, Facebook, Twitter, none of these companies use that platform for editorial purposes. If you want to talk about control, go back to the Walter Cronkite when he gave the famous talk after the Tet Offensive about why the Vietnam War was not a good thing. That single broadcast turned America against the Vietnam War. That's control. Okay, the tech companies don't do that, and they know that's not their role to do that. So blaming them for somehow control is really sort of fearing some possible thing that could possibly happen, which is never going to happen. These companies know that once they start exercising that kind of control and editorial purpose, they're going to get out of business. Second thing is, are we really saying that we would be better off for sort of the public discourse if we had 10 Facebooks or 10 Googles? I mean, why don't we just all go to 4chan? I mean, that could be our site of our site of choice, where we can go and hang out with the Nazis. I mean, thank God we have Facebook, because the 4chan people are stuck over here in this little ghetto where they don't even belong there. They belong off the internet, but whatever. So I think we have to understand that one of the great things about big tech companies and platforms is because they're so big, they're so broad, that everybody participates, that there's sort of a natural sort of avoidance of these strange extremes. Second thing I think we have to understand is, Daniel said, oh, these companies are just doing it because they have to. Well, yeah, because the fact that these companies are so big makes them hypersensitive to their reputation. That in and of itself is sort of the strongest regulatory factor that we have today. Every single thing these companies do is under the scrutiny, under the microscope. Every single person in the media, every single public interest activist group is looking at what these companies do for any sort of mistake. And so they know that. And so it keeps them on their toes. It makes them want to do good things. I say, oh, well, they should want to do it out of the goodness of their heart. Maybe they do. I don't have any insight into what their internal motivation is. All I know is what they're doing. And to me, what's wrong with that? And the last thing I'll just say, Drew, one of the main problems with this entire debate, criticizing big tech companies for all this power stuff, is it really ignores what's the most important thing here. And the most important thing is, first of all, how are consumers faring? The answer is very, very well. Before Facebook acquired WhatsApp, you had to pay for WhatsApp. Now I WhatsApp with my son out in California all the time. I don't have to pay anything. So to me, I don't get where the harm was to that. That was something that benefited all consumers. And finally, we should talk about workers. Daniel talked about workers. Look, the evidence is so clear, and that's just where I will pitch my book. And when you look at the data from the government on things like injury to workers, layoffs, wages, benefits, a whole set of things, big companies, including big tech companies, treat their workers significantly better than small companies on average. Big retailers like Amazon pay on average 26% more than small retailers do. So it's easy to pick at these companies. It's easy to criticize them. But again, the question is compared to what? And compared to small companies, we're just much, much better off having big platforms that can do what they do.
Daniel, do you want to respond at all to that? And then I want to go to John and Scott on some different points around bigness and action specifically taken in the coronavirus. But on some of these points Rob's making.
Again, one of there was a lot there, right? So I don't want to take up too much time in terms of responding and taking up other people's time that haven't had as much a chance to speak. But the biggest one I definitely want to address is that, yeah, the worker issue is pretty close to home. Yes, consumers may have benefited in terms of, you know, the cost of WhatsApp, but there's no telling that another organization couldn't have developed something. But Facebook used its dominance, right? It's overwhelming dominance in the social networking sphere to neutralize that threat. And now because they've concentrated so many users, again, network effects take over. There's a plethora of other conduct that they've engaged in. But the other thing is, yeah, again, I want to broaden the spectrum here. Yes, it's not just consumers benefiting. It's also about how workers are being treated. And again, Amazon is very clear. We've seen plenty of stories of them trying to prevent unionization, trying to again, the dismal conditions that some of these that the employees that have come forward and have articulated to the news media are just horrific. And I don't think anybody would stand some of the conditions that have. And luckily, we have coalitions like the Athena Coalition that have over 100 public interest organizations, many different unions who acknowledge that there's a problem. There's a huge problem, and that we need to fix it. And it's hard to dissociate that Amazon has market power, and that's how they're able to control their workers. That's how they're able to, sort of withstand so much backlash and able to withstand all the criticism. But we are out there fighting, and we are out there trying to bring attention to these issues and really showing that they're causing severe harm.
John, let me go back to
one thing quick.
Yeah,
why do they pay their workers significantly more than the average small retailers? Why isn't the Athena Alliance going after small abusive retailers, small companies that won't hire minorities, that discriminate on the basis of sex and age, religion, which they're legally, by the way, allowed to do? So, again, it's like, okay, it's easy to pick on a big company like Amazon, but compared to what? And that's the issue that never really gets addressed. Compared to what? Compared to small companies, big companies like Amazon are treating their workers better on average.
So let's get another voice in here. We'll keep some other points. John, what do you make of this point that because companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple are so big, so large in their capitalization, their power, if you will, they are hyper focused on their reputation, and so they're going to take actions to make sure they are kind of in a pleasing eye in the public. I mean, did you have any response to that point in particular, John?
I don't have any obviously inside information as to what motivates different companies to do any specific thing that they do, but I don't disagree with the point that the more in the public eye you are, the more likely you are to consider the reputation of your brand. I think that's true of tech companies. I think it's true of Nike and Adidas. I think it's true of, just about every large consumer-facing company that's out there. And everybody gets a turn, in the hot seat when some issue comes up that's challenging, no matter what industry they are. What I was saying earlier, though, I think still rings true, that there's nobody forcing these companies to give away hundreds of millions of dollars, right? I think all told, the amount of money that just IA member companies have either donated or helped secure relief for workers and others totals in excess of $1 billion to date, and that's just so far. in terms of services and financial support provided. So there are nobody's expecting them. There's no gun to their head. There's no sort of, as far as I'm aware, any kind of quid pro quo analysis that, hey, maybe if we donate some money to people who've lost their jobs, or people who are having a hard time because theaters are closed, the FTC isn't going to come after us. I think the FTC is going to make a decision to go after the company based on the same criteria they typically use. That they're not really going to look at this sort of thing. So I understand that people make those arguments. I don't think they ring terribly true, at least from my perspective. And I don't know how one would go about making a direct link between that analysis to show that, well, of course, that's why they did it. It's a pretty John view of
John. You when I asked the question about the 2 points Scott made about size and scale, but also kind of the nimbleness of the market, you kind of responded to the nimbleness of the market, but you didn't necessarily address the size and scale allowing companies to do stuff. I guess what I'm thinking of here is I'm thinking of the contact tracking initiatives that Google and Apple have put forward. We've talked about the misinformation kind of stepping in and points got made on that. But also, the tech industry was pretty early on. Let's work from home, right? Like, if you can work from home, and I think that the sense that I've gathered is that has contributed to the outbreak of the pandemic not being as bad in California, Northern California, as it could have been, right? So I'm wondering if you could just react to the size and scale of the industry being able to take actions for good or for ill, if you will. But is that true? Do you kind of see that as a fact of the world in terms of your industry being able to take bold decisions in a time of crisis?
What I'm seeing right now, and again, this isn't based on conversations with anybody inside of the companies, but just sort of reading the tea leaves and observing all of the work that these companies are doing to try and contribute to their communities and support this effort to try and flatten the curve and tamp down the impact of the pandemic, is that they see an opportunity to use the size and scale of their reach for good, for the public benefit. And whether it's rivals like Apple and Google working together to try and come up with technology to help track and trace, or other companies in the social media space trying to make sure that useful information about COVID-19 is getting to people in a timely manner, and to tamp down on this information. It's all part and parcel of the same effort to try and take the cards that they're dealt and take advantage of their opportunity to help people in this time of need. And that's what I'm seeing them do.
Let's talk for a minute about some of the privacy implications, not just of the contact tracing, but other aspects of these companies. Do any of the panelists want to address some of the privacy issues that we see from contact tracing or other issues? Daniel, do you want to? Rob, I saw you raised your hand there. Go ahead, Rob.
Two things. One, I remember when they were debating the GDPR in Europe, and the Swedish Oncology Association came out against the law because they said it would make oncology research more difficult, which it did. And at the time, nobody really kind of cared. It's pretty clear right now. As somebody wrote recently, I care a lot more about my mother health than I do about my privacy. So number one, I think we're going to have to reset the entire privacy debate to balance it more, to say that all of these issues really have to come up with a balance between the right to privacy and the public good. The idea that you can use data for the public good, which is clear in so many different areas of our economy and society. Secondly, when you look at how Apple and Google have designed that, they're not getting that data. There's no PII for them. In fact, many of the privacy groups have actually supported the initiative because it's designed in a way that really is about warning the individuals involved, not about giving the government information or about Google or Apple or other people marketing this for. So, if we can't even do that, which I think we can now, but if we can't even do that in society, it tells you how far distorted the privacy debate has become.
Daniel, Scott, reactions on the privacy issue. Scott, you got to unmute yourself here.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were controlling the muting. So no, I agree that people. So first, privacy was always a more nuanced debate than it was given credit for. I mean, people care about different types of privacy to different degrees. And I did a paper recently on that with Jeff Prince from Indiana University. And people, like we know, people care a lot about things like their financial information. They tended to care much less about location information than people seem to think. And now, like Rob said, we see we can see the costs and benefits of different types of privacy protection, and people will want to weigh those. And at the moment, if people might be willing to give up some additional privacy for certain types of tracing, although even as we see, the companies that are developing this are doing it with certain privacy protections in mind. So, but I think all of this makes people just more thoughtful about trade-offs than they were given credit for before.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, what's your reaction on the privacy front? I don't know if this is an issue OMI focuses or specializes in.
Well, we recognize that privacy is a big antitrust issue, is a big issue that, that's pretty much, data is essential, right, for how these companies compete, how they interact, how they're capable of effectively competing in the digital space, right? So privacy is inherently part of that debate. So yeah, we recognize that. I will agree with Scott. Yes, there is a thing about trade-offs, but it's also about oversight, right? We don't want to just turn over the reins entirely to these private companies that are using their established position to leverage their infrastructure and say, oh yeah, we can also collect all the data for you and perform this essential government function, right? We want to make sure that there is plenty of oversight, transparency, and perhaps even we should not even allow them to keep all the data that they've collected and able to use throughout this crisis. Again, we know that the tech companies are very interested in collecting health data. The Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago reported Google's Project Nightingale, just to try to get every ounce of healthcare data that they can. So we know that they're very interested in this. And so the coronavirus pandemic and the untold tragedy that's being caused definitely presents them with an opportunity to use their infrastructure again. But we should have oversight.
So I agree that I agree with the issue, the point about oversight and so on. But saying that this is an inherent government function, I'm not so sure about. I'm not sure what you mean by that. It's easy for that to become surveillance by government, and I'm not sure that we want that either.
I'll clarify a little bit. It's being able to do things in the public interest, right? Being able to do things that are able, right? I'm not advocating full government surveillance. I'm just saying is that we are instead turning over the reins to private companies, right? And that is not a good thing. We do not want these ginormous companies performing this really critical function without any sort of oversight.
That's true. I don't think I want the Trump administration doing that either.
Yeah.
Scott, what is your view on this perspective? Rob keeps coming back to that big companies are better in many measures, many metrics than small companies. Do you kind of have that same perspective, or do you have a different perspective on kind of the economics involved?
Well, it depends what we're talking about. I mean, small companies are good at some things, and big companies are good at others. And there's no definitive answer in either theory or empirical analysis of which generates more innovation. They're different. In this case, when we're talking about the things that we're doing right now, scale clearly matters. And even, I appreciate you saying that I put things, I said things that were intentioned productively rather than saying I was a hypocrite. We're seeing the benefits of scale even for some of these competitors. So Zoom, for example, comes up. They still rely on massive cloud infrastructure, and it's that kind of cloud. It's that kind of scale in cloud that allows new companies like that to scale up so quickly. It's amazing how quickly they scaled up. And they do have privacy issues. There's no doubt about that. And that, of course, raises a whole separate topic, which is, if competition and privacy are both objectives, what happens when those two are conflicting, and when they conflict in the same platform? Do you worry more about privacy, or do you care more about competition? It's a hard question to answer, but I think people do see the benefits of scale, and it's hard to say. It's hard to imagine somebody sitting at home these days and thinking, wow, these companies are responsible for so much of what's keeping my life going, that they're just terrible. It's awful how big they are that they can do something like that. I just don't see that narrative gaining many followers.
So another point I want to kind of get in here is that we've talked at other sessions of Broadband Breakfast Live Online about broadband providers, right? And the Keep Americans Connected pledge that FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has made, which is 60 days from March. These companies wouldn't cut off individuals if they didn't, pay their bills or give them late notices. So it's a kind of a pledge. And we've also addressed the issue of how the network is doing, and the network is obviously greater stress than it typically has been. I want to actually ask John a question, which is that do you find from reports from your members that they're saying, hey, this is really hard. We're trying to do this work from home is just, because if anything, they're among the heavy data users, the applications that they're working on. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the broadband networks and their reliability at this moment, but also secondarily, what's the analogy for the internet, the tech industry to what the broadband providers are doing? What's the kind of the pledge, if you will, that your companies are doing to try to sort of help America through this time of trial?
So on the first point, I unfortunately don't have any anecdotal thoughts that I can share with you other than my own personal experience and what I've heard from others, who I work with, and the Verizon Fios connection that I've got has been holding up pretty well so far. Hopefully you're not hearing the lawnmowers in my background, and maybe it's not quite that good, but it's good. And I think largely in places where there is a great deal of broadband penetration, the little bits and pieces that I've picked up in the news have suggested that, at least in the U.S., things are going fairly well. There's certainly lots of areas within the United States where there is no broadband competition, and the deployment of broadband and robust broadband is obviously something upon which internet services depend. So anything that encourages higher speed being everywhere is something that IA and its members would support, and I think is good for people, and it's good for small businesses in places everywhere in the United States. Yeah, go ahead, Rob. Sorry.
Well, actually, just finish your point, and then we'll give everyone a final thought. So
okay, got it.
John,
sorry,
what's the analogy? The analogy to the Keep Americans Connected pledge for the Internet Association. What's the tools you're using to give back?
I think Google. I'm sorry, was that to John or to me? That was
to John.
Sorry,
John.
My apologies.
Sure. So, I mean, to be honest with you, I'm not sure that we're in a place where the internet companies need to make a pledge. It's more of the proof is in the pudding, maybe, as a pledge, because our companies are full steam ahead in trying to find ways to provide more services to more people and businesses. A lot of small and medium-sized businesses already were dependent upon our companies in order to reach markets outside of their small regional areas. They're all the more so dependent on making sure that they have companies like Etsy and eBay and Amazon to be able to make money and make sure they're keeping themselves and hopefully their employees employed during this time. And I have no doubt that these companies will continue to do so because that's what they were built to do.
Okay. Well, we're running out of time. This has been a very robust and engaging discussion. I want to give everyone a chance to say a final word. Let's do Rob, Daniel, Scott, and we'll actually give John a chance to say any final thoughts. Go ahead, Rob.
Sure. So my final thing, John, I think what you should ask your members is to not cut any Google or Facebook or Twitter users off if they don't pay their bill. I think they should commit to allowing them to continue to search online for free. Obviously being facetious here, but the point being, which we always forget, and the anti-tech activists forget, I don't have a bill that I pay with Google or Facebook. I can do that all for free, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. Drew, to your other point about what the analogy is with ISPs, I think the analogy we should be looking at are state unemployment insurance websites. We just wrote a report last week. Almost 30% of them don't have mobile. You can't apply on a mobile device. They crash. They're not disability friendly. Big companies don't design websites like that. governments design websites like that. And in the crisis, it's pretty clear that we're going to need a big national push with real funding to modernize government for the internet age. So it really would worry me if we're going to go back and say, well, maybe we should have government-run ISPs. That worries me, that if we're going to have government-run ISPs, maybe they're going to be like UI agencies.
Okay. Well, useful thoughts there. Daniel, do you have some final thoughts on our topic?
Daniel's muted, I think, Drew.
Yeah, they're quiet thoughts.
Yeah.
Still trying to learn that one. To remember that point. But yeah, we're learning a lot about how important broadband is, but that still doesn't. We still cannot ignore just the immense amount of power and control that these companies have. Our nation has a long history of recognizing the inherent threat that large, especially communications, information, telecommunications companies have. And I do not believe that this crisis will completely abate and disseminate that anger and fear that people have about what big tech is able to do. And we need to address it, and we can address it. There's laws in the books. We know that they be enforced, and we are forming the coalition against them. And we're keeping the fight on.
Well, thank you for your participation, Daniel. Scott, let's give you a chance to give us some of your final thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I think I don't want to say that this is a silver lining, because the whole thing is such a catastrophe and so awful for so many people. But we are going to learn a lot from this experience. And so far we've seen ISPs, our broadband networks, passing a major stress test. And that's really important. We might learn that the next phase of building internet infrastructure involves something other than speed. Maybe we've learned that people care now more about latency or packet loss or something like that. We don't know. And I think the same will be true for internet companies. What services do they still need to work on? What did there turn out to be demand for? So there's going to be a lot of learning coming out of this, and I think the debates going forward will be different because of that.
Very good. We'll give you the last word, John, on how the tech industry is responding to the coronavirus.
Well, we're responding. We're continuing to respond. And I hope that folks stay safe. They continue to use the advantage of having technology as a means of accessing their businesses and connecting with their loved ones. And doing the things that are meaningful and are keeping us all through this difficult time. And I think that when we emerge out of this and we have other debates about very specific issues, I hope that we don't forget the important role that technology plays and the tremendous good it can be used for. And again, that we can have more balanced discussions moving forward as a result of sort of this renewed sense of the true value of technology.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Rob and John, Daniel and Scott, for your participation today. I think it's been a very, very good discussion. Next week, on Wednesday, April 29th, we'll be talking about some of the privacy issues through contact tracing and other issues. So we hope it'll be another productive discussion next week on Broadband Breakfast Live. Drew Clark, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.